Good morning, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome the audience today to this panel discussion, which is entitled Managing Cyber Risks in Turbulent Times. I'm very, very pleased to welcome everybody and to be joined by Norton Rose Fulbright and AIG. We have a really interesting panel planned for you today. Quick overview of how today is going to go. I will do everyone a favor and not speak for that long. I will set the stage with a few minutes of worth of presentation to set the agenda for today, which is really exciting. After my brief introductory remarks, you will enjoy about a 10-minute conversation from Mark, who heads cyber from AIG. There will be a 10-minute conversation from Aju, and who's a partner in Norton Rose, and then we will get into a panel discussion with everyone, with some of the other individuals that we mentioned. So without further ado, I guess the real question on my mind today, as somebody who is at the DIFC, is why are we talking about cyber risks? Why is the issue of cyber risks very, very important? And before I jump into the slides, I think the premise here is that the importance of digital, both in terms of financial technology and the digitization of economies globally and regionally, has become very, very important. COVID-19 naturally has accelerated and compressed the strategic plans of companies, countries, and regions in this space. And the logical kind of train of thought is that the more digital you have across individuals and economies and companies, naturally, the greater there are risks in terms of threats to those types of businesses. So that's the premise that we're going to follow today. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk in much detail about cyber. I'd rather have the experts talk about that. But let me spend a few minutes in setting the stage for this region and for digital. First slide, please. Thank you very much. So this conversation is happening globally, virtually, right, online, but it's happening really around the DIFC, which is the marketplace for Middle East, Africa, South Asia. And I just want to make essentially 3 points here. That why digitization is important is because the markets that our clients serve from the DIFC are demographically inverted to those in Europe and Asia. They're young, they're rapidly growing, and they occupy the youth bubble between 18 and 40 in ways that you don't see elsewhere. These are economies that are also very fast growing. The emerging market story is pretty well known. And of course, financial services is underpenetrated. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on all three. Let me just elaborate on the demographics. Next slide, please. Thank you. And again, you will see an intrinsic link between the demographic principle and digitization. Some of these reasons are obvious, some are not so obvious. Effectively, you have a generation of people ranging from 400 million in MENA to 3 billion in MEASA, who are going to consume financial services and other services, education, healthcare. And they are young and they're exposed to global trends, including digitization and mobile phone use. But this is where everything starts from. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so the question is, you have this large young population. What is interesting about digital? Why digital? And again, I'm not going to belabor the point too much here. All of you are familiar with the fact that the MEASA markets, South Asia in particular, Africa in particular, this region, GCC, all show amazing characteristics for digital adoption and mobile phone penetration. The old joke is what, you only have 2 mobile phones here? And I promise I only have 2. But aside from the joke, the reality is that uptake for these technologies is strong. You also have, given where we're at, we are at the center of financial flows. The 5 biggest remittance corridors in the world emanate from here into places like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Philippines, and other places, right? And a key point here also is there is great government enablement of digitization, which is very important. The pink bar at the bottom is simply saying that these trends are being compressed and accelerated in terms of a sense of urgency by COVID. Next slide, please. Not to belabor the point, some statistics to back up my claim. Penetration, at least in the GCC for smartphones, is 70%, significantly higher than in developed markets. The penetration rate of smartphones on an ongoing basis in our markets is 35-40%. I suspect the number is probably even higher, and it continues, right? Not only that, but people are highly likely to behave in a digital manner, which is the 85%, which is applies to the UAE and as a sample. And of course, only a fifth are actually doing it. So the opportunity is high, right? So this is just a couple of bullet points just to evidence what I've talked about in terms of digital penetration and smartphone use. Next slide, please. We'll skip this one. Next slide, please. Great. This is something which I think we'll talk about at length in the panel discussion, right? You have all of these demographic trends, and you have governments, in the case of Dubai, that's actively promoting digital, right? This is not just a bottoms-up occurrence by people demand, but it's designed as part of a national agenda to drive efficiency. And what that means, again, is it's simply to say that puts a lot more digital assets into play and makes today's conversation particularly useful. Some examples of Dubai, obviously, our ambitions with blockchain are very well known. Our ambitions on smart city, on services are well known. And the provision of public services here via digital is also very, very well known to those who live here. Next slide, please. Last but not least, scale is important. And I think I want to leave I want to end the conversation by saying that the way all this works is you've got to have the right strategy. In our case, we have developed the right strategy for growth by working very closely together with our regulator, the DFSA. We're also, because of COVID, we're looking at innovation is not just a nice to have, it is the foundational basis for the next wave of economic growth and job creation. And that's how we're looking at it. So we're taking it very, very seriously. Next slide, please. So one example of the risks that the panelists are going to talk about today is simply the scale of financial technology, or at least players that are conducting financial services in a digital manner. This is simply, the key message here is that there may be north of 400 fintechs in the GCC, 200 in Dubai, and a whole big bunch of them are in the DIFC. So scale has started, we're starting to see scale in these markets as well. Next slide, please. I'll dwell for 2 seconds on what drives this kind of momentum and scale. Look, the top 5 aspects, the existence of a globally ranked accelerator, a partnership with Startup Bootcamp, innovation licenses that give people incentives to start businesses here, focusing on the future of finance here. All these things are part of the agenda, and they're empowered by regulations that work, right? We were the first place to issue crowdfunding regs. On April 1st of this year, the DFSA launched our payments money services regulations. It's the only one in the UAE, and it's driving incredible innovation, incredible interest in financial services. The DFSA has a cyber threat intelligence platform, which, again, I'm sure we'll discuss. So the point is, we're getting scale, the strategy is working, and with that, we will start to need to look structurally at what the risks are. Next slide, please. Let me close by simply saying here that when you're serious about digital, both as a means to make industries more efficient and as well as a national agenda to drive economic growth, you have to take it seriously. It has to be holistic. You have to have ecosystem. You have to have the rules and regs. You have to have the soft and hard infrastructure. You've got to have top-notch regulations. And you've got to have the ambition, and you've got to work with partners such as AIG and Norton Rose, people who drive the ecosystem growth, to understand what those risks are and to begin to address them and mitigate them. Next slide, please. So that's it from me. Thank you for your time. What I'd like to do quickly is to pivot the conversation over into the first of 2 presentations that we're going to see. The first presentation is going to be by Mark Camillo. Let me quickly introduce Mark as well as the other speakers. Mark is head of cyber EMEA and responsible for Cyber Edge suite of end-to-end risk management solutions at AIG. Prior to this role, Mark led cyber teams for the Americas, including oversight of personal identity coverage and payment fraud products. Mark joined AIG in 2001 and obviously has held senior roles. After Mark, we will see comments from Aju bin Idir, who's a partner at Norton Rose. Let me quickly introduce you to Aju. Aju is a cybersecurity and corporate finance lawyer at Norton Rose Fulbright in Dubai. She's recognized for her experience in advising on cybersecurity, M&A, privatizations, private placement, and JVs, has a broad range of experience advising multinational clients on cybersecurity, cross-border transactions in Europe, Africa, and Middle East. So welcome to Aju. After which we will be joined by the rest of our panelists. The first of these panelists is Sebastian Hess. Sebastian joined AIG's cyber risk consulting team to help AIG European customers mitigate risks from emerging threats. Prior to joining AIG, Sebastian has mostly been in the global public sector, served as a military officer with the German Air Force, and subsequently was appointed Chief Information Security Officer for NATO's International Security Assistance Force. So join me in welcoming Sebastian. Sebastian will be joined by Shabnam Karim. Shabnam is an English qualified lawyer with the Norton Rose Fulbright Dispute Resolution Team in Dubai, where she specializes in cyber security risks and cyber liability claims, amongst other things. Shabnam has practiced in the Middle East for over 6 years, and in this time has worked on many of the most complex and high-profile matters across the region. And last but certainly not least, our panelist, we have a panelist from AIG. Her name is Alva Storen. She is AIG's senior financial lines underwriter specializing in cyber insurance. Within this role, she leads and manages the MENA professional indemnity and cyber portfolios and implements product strategies. Alva holds a law degree and is admitted to practice law in Ireland and New York State. And so without further ado, let me pass the mic, as it were, to Mark Camillo, EMEA head of cyber AIG, to talk a little bit about global and regional cyber insurance trends and claims. Over to you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Salman. I think you set the stage, very nicely, talking about, the potential for digital transformation and the opportunities that we're all seeing with this transformation. But along with that comes certain risks. And so what I want to do for the next 10 minutes is just highlight some of the things that we're seeing across Europe, Middle East, and Africa as it relates to cyber risk. First, we're seeing that risk continuing to expand. And I think, when we first looked at this risk, it was really centered around the intangible types of loss, whether that's identity theft or credit card fraud, cyber extortion. Over the last, certainly 18 months to 3 years, we've looked at sort of the physical risks as well. And so that's why you've seen a movement across the industry, recognizing that a cyber event could impact almost every line of insurance that we write, and looking at ways that we can affirmatively offer cyber coverage across those different lines. When you look at the market itself, the largest segment for cyber insurance is still the FI industry, but we've seen strong growth and interest from industries across the board, particularly since the events of WannaCry and NotPetya, as it relates to manufacturing, transportation, logistics, energy companies. So there's been significant growth in that area. At the same time, there's been a significant increase in claims. So when you look at, we're still compiling our claim statistics for 2019, but we had about 700 cyber incidents that we dealt with across Europe, Middle East, and Africa, which was up about 40% from the year before. And as we complete and we compile that analysis, we'll be sending that along, so you'll have an opportunity to read the case studies and actually delve into some of the claim scenarios, but significant claims around ransomware that we've seen over the past year. And the other thing that I just want to touch on quickly in the presentation is just talking about, from an underwriting perspective, how we're moving towards more transparency in the underwriting process. There's been a big movement to try to provide more information back to clients about how they rate as a cyber risk. So on the next slide, when you look at cyber as a peril, this is how we're thinking about cyber at AIG. So first, we're looking at non-physical cyber risk, because that would be a cyber event causing intangible loss. And when you purchase a typical standalone cyber insurance policy, the types of coverages that would be included would be the event management, so just dealing with the incident, whether that's forensics, legal assistance, public relations, the liability that could potentially result from potentially regulatory actions, or there might be civil defense costs and damages. So that would be picked up underneath the liability section. From a business interruption perspective, that's where we're seeing more of the severity claims, so covering the loss of income and the increased cost of working as part of that network interruption coverage. In addition to the cyber extortion, even if the demand is not paid, you may still have considerable data restoration, data recreation cost, which is the fifth bucket that we typically, when we look at traditional cyber insurance and non-physical, what the coverage would pick up and cover. And then we're also looking at the physical as well. So if you had a cyber event that caused bodily injury or potentially property damage, that would be picked up where we provide affirmative cover for those physical perils. So again, it's important for each company to go through and understand, through certain scenarios, if there was an impact, where that loss could impact the organization, how that would line up across all the insurance that an organization has. On the next slide, to get to more in-depth underwriting, you're starting to see more enhanced underwriting questionnaires being used, and particularly because you've seen a significant number of claims, particularly over the last 18 months as it relates to ransomware. The market is starting to harden, so you're seeing more questions being asked, but also the types of questions are shifting a bit. So if you look at the new smart application that we have, you can see that we ask significant number of control questions, which automatically adjust based on the industry. So there's a totally different question set if you're a manufacturing risk versus a payment processor, for example. And as you can see, the questions are actually starred, so you can understand from our perspective what are the most important questions, and we try to rearrange and prioritize those questions that will give you the biggest bang for the buck. Those questions that if you have those appropriate controls, those are the ones that we're going to take into consideration for the underwriting process, and where you might see differences in terms of the limits available, the coverage available, including the deductible, the premium, et cetera, being set again based upon the cybersecurity maturity of the organization. So on the next slide, the way that this all works is that when we take all of this information, we're also taking in a number of external factors as well. So when you look at the first step, looking at the threat likelihood, that's going to change, potentially each month or even daily, depending upon the types of threats that are out there and what the bad guys are specifically targeting. So we're looking at about 50 different data sources that are feeding the model, including publicly available resources, in addition to data that we would license from sources like BitSight and Security Scorecard. All of that threat information goes into the model. Then we're looking at the business impacts, those questions that I showed earlier, where we're asking if you had something that impacted your web applications, how long would it take before there was a significant impact? And so when we look at the threat information, the threat impact, if a company did absolutely nothing, that would be the implicit risk. So we look at the inherent risk associated with that particular risk, and then we apply the control effectiveness. So after we look at the controls that we again find the most effective based on our claims data and based on the CIS 20 controls, we can then determine what the residual risk is, and we compare that to the probability and the impact. That's how we're determining, again, the overall cybersecurity maturity of the risk that we're writing. So on the next slide, you can see that at a very high level, this is the type of dashboard that our underwriters would be able to view on each individual risk. So in this particular example, it's a retail company, roughly $500 million in size. There's a peer universe of 100 to 499 other risks that we write that are similar to this, and we also judge this to be a very moderate, again from a risk perspective, and from a cybersecurity maturity perspective, you can see they're developing. So it takes into consideration a number of things, from the threat likelihood to the business impact, the implicit risk, looking at the control effectiveness, and how we then calculate the residual risk. And then we start modeling out, based again on our claim experience, what we're seeing again from over those, just last year alone, having over 700 incidents. We can then map out what we think a worst case data breach would cost, a worst case business interruption for that particular risk. We also model what a worst case sort of ransomware would look like. And for that particular risk, we look at, these are the top 5 things that this particular company should be the most concerned about, what they're most likely to be, if they were compromised, what type of threat would likely, cause that loss. And then we also can provide back, these are the top 5 things that if you were to implement any control, these are the top 5 things that we feel would give you the most bang for the buck. And on the next slide, you can see that what we're aiming to do is by again taking in all that information, we can present that back to the client to give them actionable information, and they can see the same information that we as the underwriter see, so they can make choices in terms of what controls that they should implement. And we also try to assist by helping bend the risk curve down by not only providing this information, but also providing loss prevention services as part of the policy. So this is something that's also new. When the policies were first introduced, there was a big focus on the incident response. So making sure there was a 24/7 response for the forensics, bringing in, Norton Rose, for example, to help from a legal perspective, bringing in the PR support. If an extortion consultant was needed, bringing that expertise in. So that was the main focus when the insurance was first introduced. But now you're seeing that shift towards the loss prevention. So what tools can we as the insurer provide that can help, reduce and potentially prevent a loss from occurring in the first place? So you're seeing things like vulnerability scans being included as part of the policy. So you're actually scanning the network for vulnerabilities. If we find vulnerabilities, making those recommendations and prioritizing those in terms of what should be addressed first, and then rescanning once those vulnerabilities have been patched to make sure that they have been fixed, and then they can no longer be seen. Also providing e-learning platforms so that we can help educate clients, because one of the things that we're seeing is that in most of the claims that we see, there's a human factor, a human element that's playing into this, whether clicking on links or sending confidential information. There's typically something that where a human is involved, and if we can again train them, they can almost be a first line of defense instead of a liability. And providing intelligence. So as we identify bad IP addresses, if we can block those sites, if we can block from those attackers from getting in, as well as blocking employees. So if they actually get a phishing link and they try to click on that and go to one of those sites, if we can block that before that happens, that's another advancement. And I think this is an ongoing area. We're as we identify, particularly with ransomware becoming particularly problematic for many of our clients, if we identify certain malware, certain indicators that our client could potentially be breached imminently, we're proactively reaching out. In many cases, even providing that support to help fix that. I should point out that none of these services are mandatory; they're all optional. And again, I see this as an area that where the industry and carriers like AIG are going to continue to lead in introducing these types of services. So on the next slide, you can see, as an example, this e-learning platform, here's, 40 different, training modules in 11 different languages. It's interactive. So, employees actually, have to, click on links, solve problems, making sure they're actually understanding the information. And, this can help, again, build this defense by design, because again, if you have all your employees trained, if we're providing this threat intelligence, for blocking attacks, and you do happen to get breached, well, sometimes, bad things happen to good companies, but this can help, particularly if there's a regulatory investigation, in sort of framing that discussion. So to wrap this up, again, we're starting to see, the cyber claims are definitely increasing in both frequency and severity. Next slide, please. We are viewing cyber as a peril. So it's not just limited to the non-physical risk. We are looking at physical risk as well. And again, depending upon the company, depending upon the industry that you're in, making sure that you're looking at it, across the board and seeing how your insurances align. with the whole underwriting process, it is becoming more transparent. So you are seeing additional tools being implemented, trying to provide that intelligence back to clients. And you are seeing these loss prevention services becoming a critical addition for end-to-end risk management. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aju to continue our discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark and Salman, and hi everybody. I'm Aju Benidi. I'm the head of cyber risk for Northmost Boulevard in the Middle East. And so now we are going to talk about cyber risk, but more from a legal perspective. And I will try and give you in the time allocated to me a few tips to understand and manage a cyber risk. But we can have a discussion afterward during the panel session. So let's start with the first slide. So this just sets out the agenda of what we are going to talk about. We can now move to the second slide and just dive into the discussion. So the growing challenge of cyber risk. Cyber is, over the past few years, the cyber concern went from basically the IT departments to the boardroom. So it's definitely a boardroom concern nowadays. And as Salman pointed out, the digitization of corporate risk over the past 30 years has just increased the focus on cyber from top management. And talking about the turbulent times, we're talking about, of course, the COVID concern. And here I would like to flag that total global threats are at highest recorded levels. So the COVID situation is a source of concern with its remote working. And also we have noticed that there has been a focus shift of IT teams to managing the HR issues during COVID and the business performances rather than spending time focusing on the security of the IT system. So this has allowed a lot of vulnerabilities to happen. But if we also focus more on looking at what's happening in the Middle East and the North Africa region, cyber is going to increase more given the use in this region of smart devices, which is set to grow over the next year, and the slow move to more remote working. So the post-COVID life will be completely different from the before COVID life. People are asking for more remote working and are asking for more technology platforms to use to deliver their work. So, and to communicate. And this means that there will be a lot of sharing of commercial and personal data, but also sensitive data. So this is a high risk from a cyber perspective and a concern for legal advisors. But as Mark pointed it out, employees are also another concern from a cyber perspective in the MENA region specifically. I was reading a few studies recently that said that basically the majority, if not a great part of employees in the Middle East and the North Africa region are not sufficiently trained to detect potential cyber issues, etc. So they do not fully understand the risk of using personal devices in the workplace, and this coupled with the post-COVID situation, there is a need for companies to actually and strongly be cyber ready in this context. So I tend to say to my clients that organizations across the Middle East and North Africa region must now realize that it is no longer if they will be the subject of a cyber attack or cyber incident, but when is this going to happen? So this is important to be prepared. And this also shows how insurers also have changed the way they approach cyber from a policy perspective with all the e-learning tools that Mark just explained. So if we move to the other slide, talking quickly about the types and sources of cyber risks. There are various sources. They can be external or internal. I'm talking about cyber attacks or cyber incidents because they are different. I would say that cyber attacks will come from an external source. It will be like an ex-employee unhappy with trying to hack your system, a competitor trying to get information. And it also brings down the topic of nation-state attacks that we can talk about later. But it's also attacks from hacktivists, not activists, but hacktivists. So it's the typical ransomware attack. And from an internal sources, it will be more what I would call a cyber incident. So an employee's mistake, like a big finger mistake, where an employee just send some personal data to the wrong person, or some glitch in your system that will allow leakage of information, etc. So all of these elements are covered under the cyber risk topic, although there are different type of cyber activities, basically, if you want to cover them under one element. And talking about the types of cyber risk, it's important to say that there is a wide range of risks to consider when considering and anticipating cyber, and each of these risks can adversely affect the company. Affect the company, I mean by that, affect the competitive position of the company, affect the stock price, affect the shareholder value, or the business performances. And if we look at the risks, I've listed few of the main risks. There are more than that. I mean, the list is huge. But the more important would be, you need to be concerned about the regulatory risk. Definitely about the reputational risk, because it's the one that you will need to manage very quickly from the outset. And this is why it's important to have the right advisors in place, not just lawyers, but also PR risk teams specialized in managing this type of reputational impact. And another important risk, a type of risk, is the loss of contract, because it has a direct impact on the shareholder value. Shareholder value becomes important for a listed company, and listed companies are also the target of cyber attacks or victim of cyber incidents. So if we move to the next slide, we can now dive into the more strictly legal aspect of this presentation and look at the UAE legal and regulatory framework. So talking about the UAE legal and regulatory framework is making a distinction between what's happening onshore in the UAE and what's happening in free zones, but also paying attention to what's happening outside of the UAE. So if we look at the onshore UAE data protection legal framework, it's quite complex, I have to say, when it comes to advising on cyber issues, assuming that the focus is only on data privacy. Because there is currently no federal data protection regulator, or consolidated piece of legislation. But this doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want from a data privacy perspective. There are relevant data protection principles that are covered across various pieces of UAE legislations. If we take, for example, the penal code, under the penal code, it is a criminal offense to publish matters relating to a person's private life or disclosing a secret. A secret would be any type of confidential information, really. It's a concept that can be twisted as need be. And there is a cybercrime law, if you don't know, it has been enhanced also recently, which make it an offense to basically use IT to invade someone's privacy or to gain unauthorized access to a website, for example. So these are the main sets of law, but there are also specific rules that would apply to specific sectors. If you are a company active in the healthcare sector, the telecommunication sector, or the banking sector, you would have to consider whether your regulator, the TRA or the central bank, has issued regulations around data privacy, and I can tell you that they exist and they would apply to you. So all of these different laws and regulations have an impact on the use of personal data in the UAE onshore. So put in your mind that just because there is no consolidated piece of legislation onshore in the UAE, doesn't mean that it is not applicable. So that's the UAE onshore mainland. If we look at the free zone situation, we need to extract the DFC and ADGM from that group of free zones. Apart from the DFC and the ADGM, the other free zones pretty much follow what's happening onshore. But DFC and ADGM have their own set of regulations when it comes to data protection. And here I would like to flag that the most sophisticated and closer in line with the data protection regulations that exist in Europe is the new DFC data protection law. I don't know if you're aware, but it will come into force on the 1st of July 2020 with a window maybe of 4 months for given to companies to implement it and review their data protection processing activities and to prepare. If you are familiar with the GDPR, that's GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulations, applicable in the EU region. The new DFC data protection law is as sophisticated. So I just invite you to make sure that you look at it if your activities touch the DFC. So this allows me to make a link with GDPR. GDPR is an EU regulation, but here again, just because GDPR is a European regulation doesn't mean that it will not impact your business in the Middle East in the event of a cyber incident. GDPR, what you need to know is that it has what we call an extraterritorial effect. It might apply outside of the EU, and it requires compliance from companies outside of the EU. For example, if your business is set up here in the EU, but you have an establishment in the EU, and you rely on that establishment economically, then GDPR is likely to be applicable. Also, if you offer goods and services online to targeted consumers in the EU, then GDPR might apply. It's very important to make this assessment, and we have prepared an infographic on that with the AAG that is available on their website to assess your exposure. It's very important because in the context of a cyber incident, if there is a link with GDPR, then GDPR, the mandatory notification requirements from a GDPR perspective and the sanctions are very, very strict. So you may, and I get this question a lot, you might wonder how do we link the data protection legislations to cyber? It's linked through the concept of mandatory data breach notification. That is a requirement in data privacy regulations when there is a cyber incident and some data has been extracted, leaked, lost, etc. So data breaches are often international, so affecting various jurisdictions. And the key role from a legal perspective is to understand what regulations apply to each jurisdiction, affected jurisdiction, as soon as possible, because time is of the essence in the event of a cyber incident or cyber attack. For example, in the EU or in ADGM, the regulator must be notified of the data incident within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach. Otherwise, financial or or regulatory sanctions might apply. And when I say financial sanctions under GDPR, it's at least 20 million euros. So that's quite significant. And the main notification requirements when suffering a cyber incident are to the regulator or the data subjects. And depending on the requirements will differ depending on the jurisdiction in which is affected. For example, there is no mandatory obligation to notify a data subject in the UAE onshore. It's recommended, but there is no mandatory obligation. Versus a mandatory requirement in the new DFC data protection law, and it wasn't the case before. So all of that is just to give you a few tips from a legal perspective as to what to be concerned about and what to look at. And this said, consideration should also be given to which other bodies should be notified in the event of a cyber incident. And here I'm talking about your contractual counterparties, because their commercial data might have been affected. Also, it's not personal data. You will need to think about managing their expectation and protecting your business relationship with them. I'm talking about the market authorities if you're a listed company. I'm also talking about sector-specific regulators. A bank will need to notify something to the central bank in the UAE. And last but not least, the law enforcement. You will need to think very carefully about your move when it comes to notifying the police, because in the UAE, there is an obligation to notify a crime when you are aware of that crime. There are sanctions for not doing so. Sanctions are not huge. So clients generally have this moment where we have a discussion as to whether or not notifying the law enforcement, because although they have cybercrime units, they can investigate this type of incident. It's taking away the investigation from you and the control over how you want to communicate, etc. So just wanted to put that out there because it's quite important, and this is quite a typical discussion that we have with our clients on this aspect. If we move to the best practice summary slide, I just here I thought I would give you a few tips for a better management of your cyber risks and few tips for you in the context of responding to a cyber attack. First, be prepared, of course. I mean, Mark mentioned that you need to have all the policies in place. I'm not just talking about insurance policies, but internal policies as to how to respond to a cyber incident, how to respond to a phishing email, what is the internal protocol, and test these policies, put them, practice your response, train your employees, get all the e-learnings possible. It's very important. It's linked to all the studies around, I mean, employees in the Middle East who are not sufficiently trained. Respond quickly, time is of the essence. We touched about it. We touched on it when talking about the notifications. You need to get a specialized team of advisors on board and select them before anything happens. Don't wait until something happens and go and send an RFP. You don't have time to send an RFP when we're talking about cyber incidents. And make sure that you respond comprehensively, get all the stakeholders in your organization involved, aware, which means that when you get prepared and you put in place all these internal policies, have a cyber response team named in the policy, in your internal policies, to make sure that these people would be readily available and aware that they have something to do to respond quickly. Of course, be aware of the reputational fallout, get the PR team involved, mindful of the legal and regulatory framework. Of course, notifications are very important. And an important point that I keep on repeating to clients is focus on the human aspect. It's very, very important for you to assess the impact of your decisions, because you will have to make decisions very quickly. The impact on your employees first, because they are the ones who are making your business run. The impact on your business partners and the impact on your customers. So the PR risk team and the lawyers will advise you on how to communicate things and what would be the impact and how to mitigate the impact on this category of people. So just wanted to finish with saying how we can help, and we can definitely help you protect yourself against cyber incidents, but also help you respond to cyber incidents.
Right.
And thank you very much. Just you can get in touch with me or Shannon if you have any questions. Thank you, Salman. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Aju, very much. Let me ask the panelists. We have about 12 or 13 minutes. We're going to try and pull in the panelists quickly. Let me ask all the panelists to turn their cameras and mics on. And let me quickly pull in Sebastian into the conversation and quickly get his views on what AIG Cyber Insurance is currently doing when it comes to prevention loss services. Hi, Sebastian. Welcome to the conversation.
Hey, good morning, Salman. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, from my perspective, AIG is trying to do something quite important, and that is really tackling the cyber risk posture from the three most important components that are always relevant when it comes to reducing cyber risk. And that's the people component, the process component, and the technology component. And while Mark talked about a few of the specific services already, I think it's important to really take that high-level view, because in the end, what we're trying to do is getting to a point where our insureds identify threats quicker, find ways to prevent and detect threats, and also, of course, come into a position where they can then respond appropriately. So everything, of course, circles, or a lot of things circle, of course, around the human factor, and that is quite simple, because if we just take the attacker's view here, is then usually the attacker needs some involuntary help to get into an organization. That's where the employee comes in. So one of the key components that we have in our pre-loss services is really the user awareness training, the employee training, to then hopefully get the employees to a state where they do the right things and prevent them from doing any harm. And all the other services, of course, support the other aspects of becoming faster in detecting and responding. And I don't want to take too much time, so I'm just going to stop here with the answer.
No, thank you. I want to pull in Alva into the conversation. Alva, Aju talked about, or was it Mark perhaps, talked about, or I think it was Aju, talked about this agenda moving from the IT department to the boardroom, particularly in the Middle East. So question for you, Alva, what kind of information do you need when you talk about buying cyber insurance, and anything in particular from your observation about Middle East companies and how they buy cyber insurance?
Salman. Hello, everyone. I guess from an underwriting perspective, we do have a number of tools that we use, and Mark did allude to some of those, but I guess the industry would be a big factor in terms of, are you a retailer? Have you got online presence? Do you process a lot of data? So for us, I suppose we need to categorize which industry and what level of threat is attached to that. And also I think the most important thing for us is to look at the risk management and I suppose the resources put in place internally to handle cybersecurity. I think it's important for people to know that a cyber insurance policy is not a replacement for risk management. And it's not just an IT issue either. It's a whole, it's a C-suite issue for sure, but it involves risk, it involves legal, compliance, the CISO, and all of that. So we need to see that there's buy-in there at the top level, and that there's an actual budget put towards IT security, and that it's been taken very seriously. For us, we need to be comfortable if we're taking on a business risk that, they are prepared, I guess. And as you did allude to that also in terms of, have they got their internal policies and procedures in place? Has a business continuity plan being tested? So we're seeing now during COVID, most businesses are testing their business continuity plan for the first time. And there's all sorts of employees are working at home, and some of them could be working on personal devices. There might be lack of penetration testing, patches. They could be clicking on links to update software. So there is a certain, there's an enhanced threat there at the moment with COVID. But for us in the Middle East, we'd be looking to see that people are taking it seriously. They're investing in cybersecurity, and that they have a robust risk management policy in place.
Shabnam, I'm wondering, Shabnam, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering, we're talking about cyber risk, and obviously wherever there's risk, there's some kind of liability at either end of that risk. And so I'd love to get your views on kind of what you're seeing from a cyber liability perspective, and maybe what kinds of steps companies or people are taking.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me, Salman?
Yep.
So I think it's good to take a step back and look at where liability can arise in a cyber scenario. We talk a lot about incidents and, essentially how can an organization or its management be liable? And there's various categories. You've got liability from employees bringing claims, data subjects. For example, in a professional services context, you may have customers, clients whose data you hold on your systems, which is sensitive and personal, and of course shareholders whose shares have been adversely impacted. And then you've got claims by regulators, and you might have claims by other third parties like outsourced providers who have also been impacted because organization A's systems have been breached. And conversely, what you see, and specifically in this region, where an organization has been breached, it may be that they have claims against third parties like outsourced companies, payment processing firms, because it may be that the breach actually occurred within that organization and access was gained to your systems through a weak link in that third party's system. So across the world, we are seeing liability claims relating to all those scenarios, claims by employees, class actions by shareholders, and of course, regulatory claims, etc. I think here what we're really seeing is a lot more financial crime related cyber attacks to do with phishing, business email compromise. And so you often see claims where there's a recovery of those funds which may have been wrongfully transferred. But I think increasingly we're going to start moving into the scenario that we're seeing globally, which is claims against organizations and against management of those organizations for mismanaging their cybersecurity framework, and not taking adequate precautions, and for not handling data in accordance with the legislation that is developing in the region.
Back to Sebastian on this one, though. I mean, is this bad news for technology providers or for a technologist? Because essentially, no matter what you do, you can never plug the gap or the leak in terms of liability, or do technology solutions, big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, do these things actually have the potential for impacting or managing or reducing the kind of liability that Shabnam's talking about? Love to get a more technical view.
Sure. So maybe I'll start with taking a step back. One of the biggest challenges that we're struggling with when it comes to all of this is just looking back at the late 70s, at the 80s, when all the internet technology was pretty much developed and founded. And back then, the focus really was on robustness, and no one was really thinking about security or any of those aspects that matter today, like privacy. So in the end, we ended up playing catch up for many, many decades, and we're still playing catch up. And a lot of the problems that we see today are a result of those early problems. So having said that, I really believe that we are seeing very, very good and strong trends where enterprises are starting to tackle the challenges that come with securing their systems and also having the right access and storage to data now more and more. And the key really here is security and privacy by design, because what we have learned over the years is that it's very, very hard to secure something after the fact, or it's very, very expensive. But if you do the right things right from the beginning, then it becomes much easier. So that is really an important factor. And then the other factors are also coming into play, where for the longest time, security or proper security was really very much a people problem, because you needed to have large amounts of people, analysts, really looking for events, looking for data, and trying to find a needle in a haystack. And they're looking at technology like machine learning, like potentially artificial intelligence, really help us a lot to reduce the need for a large security force. So, and therefore, again, also making it more economically reasonable for product developers, for companies to invest into more security. And then lastly, I think one of the key factors is also we need to figure out ways to reduce our complexity. So we cannot really always add more and more things onto our systems, so we need to find ways to really streamline the services, make them more transparent, and then it also becomes more easily securable. But overall, a lot of moving parts that need to be taken into consideration. But we're on the right track. I really believe that.
So back to you before we close. Are people buying this? Are companies, spending, at least on the insurance side? Are companies starting to actually spend money to manage their liability? And is this business taking off to the extent that you're able to share?
Thanks, Salman. Absolutely. It's a very, very popular product. It's high risk. We're seeing a lot of claims, and we're able to share, I suppose, our claims data, with our brokers and our partners to kind of show, I suppose, the trends that we're seeing, the type of industries that are being targeted. And when we are discussing other product renewals, such as professional indemnity, our D&O insurance, cyber is always in the conversation. So I think, especially with the working from home scenario now, I think it's a real heightened risk, and we're certainly, seeing a lot more submissions. I think as well in the Middle East, there's increased media attention now on cyber, certainly in the last year or so. I've seen so many, studies done by Symantec or Dark Matter, and they're referring to, 4 out of 5 organizations in 2019 had a cyber attack. And I guess there was always the geopolitical tension there for decades, and I think that there's a lot of state-sponsored acts that are still carrying on, but they're moving into the cyberspace now, which is an increased threat as well. So absolutely a lot of activity. I think it's relatively a new product in this market, and I think there's people, I suppose, are curious as to exactly what it covers, and so we often discuss scenarios as to what are your crown jewels, and what do you want to protect, and what steps have you put in place to protect that in terms of your internal procedures, etc. So absolutely a lot of interest. Obviously it's a high risk product in that we're seeing a lot more ransomware demands in the millions of dollars, whereas before they were in hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're seeing increased, monetary values being demanded. So, we're paying a lot more out. We're seeing a lot more claims, and we're sharing that with people just to, I suppose, create a bit more awareness about the threat. So it's a continuous effort, but it's taken off, and we're extremely busy with cyber submissions, and a long may it continue.
So we're out of time, but what I want to do is close with going down the row with our panelists and ask you the impossible question, of course, but these are fun to do, which is, what's your kind of 30-second or one-liner on what to watch out for in the next 12 months? Mark, let's start with you.
So I think over the next 12 months, I think, ransomware is going to continue to be problematic for many companies. I think that, particularly given the current situation that we're in, anytime you tend to see an economic downturn, you do tend to see a spike in incidents. We saw that back in 2008 in the financial crisis. And so I do think that, the bad guys are continually changing their tactics. They're using, multiple vectors now to get in, where it's not just as simple as, phishing emails, but looking for, vulnerabilities in RDP protocol, for example, particularly with everyone or a good number of people working from home. So I do think that that's going to be problematic, and we're going to continue to see, quite a bit of activity in this space.
Super, thank you. Aju, how about you? Next 12 months.
Next 12 months, of course, ransomware attacks, but at the moment, the focus is also on clients who are more government-owned clients, and they are very, very concerned about nation-state attacks. So this is what, I guess, in the next 12 months, the geopolitics of the region will tell us, but nation-state attacks are also a very big concern in the region.
Thank you, Aju. Sebastian, how about yourself? Next 12 months.
Yeah, from my perspective, it always comes down to follow the money. So we need to figure out what is it that the bad guys, organized crime primarily, is after, and they're of course always after making money. And from that perspective, it comes down to, on one side, we need to be really good at the basics to make it harder for them to succeed, and then it will also come down to not becoming the easiest target. So they have to find ways to make more money, and so they will have to up their game, but they also will end up going for companies that are easier to attack than others. So I think that will be a trend that we will see, that the bar will rise over the next month.
Thank you, Sebastian. Shabnam, next 12 months, what do you think?
So I think I agree with everybody about the ransomware concern that we all have. I'd like to think that there are some industries in this region that are taking very adequate steps to try and at least mitigate the risk that they have. I think a focus might have to be on healthcare and pharmaceutical industries globally, but healthcare specifically in this region because of the steps that they have taken to digitize and offer services with the use of novel technology, given the crisis that we're in. So those would be the sectors that I think have to be particularly aware.
Super. And that leaves Alva with the last word for today.
Thanks, Salman. I think criminal insider threats are going to be a growing concern for businesses. I think as we're seeing salary cuts and redundancies, are commonplace now due to the pandemic, we're going to have a lot of disgruntled employees and possible retaliation attacks on employers, similar to what happened in the Morrison's case in the UK. So I think we need to, I think insider threats are going to become heightened in the coming months.
Super. And with that, we come to the end of today's really, really interesting conversation on cybersecurity and cyber threats. I wanted to thank each and all of our panelists, Mark Camillo, Aju Ben Idir, Sebastian Hess, Shabnam Karim, and Alva Storen. Thank you all for your contributions and for the discussion. And thank you to the audience. Stay safe. Thank you.